Muslims by Ali Mahmood. Episode 4. In the 12th century, the two great empires of the time were the Muslims in the Middle East and the Chinese in the Far East. Between these two great empires lay a vast land, bypassed by history, whose inhabitants were the nomad Mongols, who lived as they had always lived, on horseback, in tribes without cities, without houses, without books. It was here that Temujin was born, who would later be known as Genghis Khan, the World Conqueror. His father died and he was raised by his mother. Survival was not easy, and adversity turned the helpless and illiterate child into a warrior who created the greatest empire in history, a lawmaker whose Yasa gave his people a code that endured long after his death, and a leader whose wisdom and discipline inspired and transformed his followers. He imposed a system based on merit. Young Temujin was captured and locked into a big wooden collar called a kang. He escaped, but knowing it was futile to flee with no horse, no food, and a kang around his neck, he appealed to the family that had been his recent jailer who hid him. Temujin had a magical ability to persuade and seduce. He was saved, and many years later he rewarded his saviors with the privileges of not paying taxes and sharing the emperor's cup. All those who helped Genghis were rewarded, all who resisted him were destroyed. The most important of the early followers of Genghis were two brothers, Jelmi, who once saved his life by sucking out the poison from an arrow that wounded the neck of the Khan, and Subutai, who went on to become the greatest general in history. Subutai conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles. His achievements surpassed Alexander as he conquered Korea, China, Persia, Hungary, and Russia. Europe was only saved by the death of Genghis Khan, which required all Mongols to return to Mongolia to elect his successor. Subutai was a master of deception and surprise and possessed the soul of a gambler, which Napoleon considered the most important trait of a great general. In 1201, Genghis was the vassal of the Mongol warlord Ong Khan. In 1206, at the age of 39, he was proclaimed Khan of Khans. He said, "In the space of 7 years, I have succeeded in accomplishing a great work and uniting the whole world in one empire." In the 20 years he ruled till his death, he destroyed the Jin dynasty of North China and took the great empire of the Muslim Khwarezm Shah, which covered Central Asia and Afghanistan. Even after his death, Subutai continued his relentless march through Russia, sacking Moscow and Kiev. Genghis's sons and grandsons conquered Central Asia and the Middle East, destroying Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate. Genghis inspired terror. In revenge for the killing of his father, he ordered that every Tatar male taller than 3 feet be killed. When he defeated the Taitiot, their chiefs were boiled alive. For the Muslims, these were terrible times. The key to the invincibility of the Mongols was the horse. Every Mongol fought on horseback. He even slept on his horse, and when there was no food, he would open a vein from the neck of his horse and drink the blood. In the wide steppes, where there was always fodder for his horse, he was invincible. For an army of 100,000 with 500,000 horses, grasslands were as crucial as oil to a modern army. But most importantly of all was the leadership of Genghis Khan. His vision, wisdom, and uncanny instinct in recognizing the abilities of people as diverse as Subutai the general and the sage Yeliu Chitsai, and binding them with the loyalty he inspired, created a dedicated leadership that endured even after his death. No less amazing than his conquests was the Yasa, the code of law that this illiterate nomad, who had never seen a city, imposed on the 50 nations that comprised his empire. Criminal activity was totally eradicated. It was said that a naked virgin with a sack of gold could pass through the empire with complete security. Drunkenness was discouraged. A man who is drunk is like one struck on the head. His wisdom and skill avail him not. Get drunk only 3 times a month. It would be better not to get drunk at all, but who can abstain altogether? After Genghis's death, Subutai continued to lead the armies. Yeliu Chutsai ran the empire like a modern-day prime minister. His greatest contribution was to save the Chinese nation from Mongol genocide. When the Mongols were tempted to kill the Chinese and erase their cities, Yeliu proposed an alternate policy of taxation to keep the wealth flowing to Mongol headquarters. The empire reached its peak under Mongke, Genghis's grandson, his brothers Hulagu in the west, and Kublai in China, and his cousin Batu in Russia. Mongke detested luxury, was not greedy for personal wealth, and was untouched by frivolous pleasure. He was tolerant of all religions. The 8 years of his rule was a golden period. He died from cholera and Europe was saved as the Mongol generals withdrew. The Muslim Middle East was saved as Hulagu withdrew. A strange twist of fate saved the Muslims from destruction from the Mongols. Berke, the brother of Batu, when traveling through Bukhara, converted to Islam. In Persia, only 30 years after the death of Hulagu, his descendant Ghazan also converted to Islam. Now both the Mongol empires in the Middle East and Russia were Muslim. They had come to conquer Islam, but instead Islam had conquered them, not through battle, but by winning their hearts and souls. Timur, the last of the world conquerors, was an avid chess player whose intelligence was unmatched and whose strategies in war left him undefeated over his rule of 36 years, of which all but 2 years were spent campaigning in the saddle. He was unmatched as a rider, hunter, or warrior. He never laughed and in all his life never appreciated a jest. He ruled without ministers or advisors and succeeded in all his enterprises. He was kind and generous to all except those who did not obey him, and these he punished. He loved justice and the company of learned men. He rose from obscurity without advantage of family or wealth. His only advantages were his total fearlessness, his brilliant mind, and his amazing ability to inspire loyalty from his fellows. He married Sare Khanum, a descendant of Genghis Khan, and took the title of son-in-law. Timur offered a simple choice to his adversaries: surrender and you will be spared, resist and you will be annihilated. The great cities of Central Asia surrendered without a blow. Those that resisted were reduced to a tower of skulls as walls, trees, and people were destroyed. Timur's conquest of Persia was interrupted by news that Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, was invading Timur's territory. This angered Timur, who could not tolerate invasion, particularly by Toktamish, who had previously come to Timur as a supplicant and whom Timur had restored as Khan of the Golden Horde. Toktamish as Khan was a very different man from Toktamish the fugitive. He ran a mighty empire and was an outstanding warrior who had learned the art of war under Timur himself. Timur hurried back to Samarkand and, despite the cold snow of winter, chased after Toktamish, who retreated 1,800 miles. When the armies met, Toktamish had the larger army and positional advantage. The Turks had Timur. The armies clashed and the fighting continued for 3 days. Toktamish, fearing for his life, withdrew. The Mongol army was smashed. Timur had shown that when 2 matched armies fight, it is the courage of the leader that determines victory and defeat. 3 years later, Toktamish was back. Once again, Timur defied danger, but Toktamish withdrew to save his own life. The Golden Horde was destroyed. Saray, their capital, was plundered and torched, leaving Toktamish a fugitive, never again to threaten his master Timur. Next, Timur marched to India, where he took Delhi. When the Hindus made a suicidal stand, Timur ordered the massacre of the population. He then plundered everything of value, including a pair of white cockatoos, which fascinated him. In the Middle East, Timur had already conquered Iran and Baghdad. He now proceeded against the Ottomans, whose ruler, Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, was renowned for his prowess in battle. Bayezid had the best infantry in the world. Timur had the best cavalry. The future of the world would be decided in the Battle of Ankara. Europe prayed for the victory of Timur. If Bayezid won, Europe was doomed to being absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Timur repositioned his troops constantly to secure a positional advantage. For 8 days he disappeared, then finally reappeared between Bayezid and Ankara. He lured Bayezid into a forced march to defend Ankara in a battlefield that offered all the advantage to Timur. 20,000 of Bayezid's troops had died from thirst and exhaustion in the maneuvers. Timur had as good as won the battle before the first blow was struck. As the battle raged, Timur, confident of victory, sat down to play a game of chess with his son. When Bayezid was captured and brought to Timur, he smiled. Bayezid, bold to the end, reprimanded Timur, saying that he should not mock one whom God has afflicted. Timur replied, "I smiled that God should have given the mastery of the world to a lame man like me and a blind man like thee." Bayezid died in captivity. Timur, now old and infirm and barely able to speak, set out to conquer China. It was winter and bitterly cold. Timur caught a fever and died on the road. His dying advice to his heir and grandson, Pir Muhammad, were, "Make justice the guide of all your actions, and the empire will long remain in your hands. But if discord and disunity creep in, ill fortune awaits you." Pir Muhammad never sat on the throne. Civil war destroyed the family, and within a century, the vast empire of Timur disappeared. The Delhi Sultanate. Muslim rule in India started with the conquest of the young and charismatic Muhammad bin Qasim, who met his tragic end sewn inside the skin of an ox as punishment for a crime he did not commit, victim to political intrigue back home. 2 centuries later, India was repeatedly plundered by the fierce warrior Mahmud of Ghazni, before being conquered by Muhammad Ghori, who left as his viceroy Qutbuddin Aibak, the first ruler of the Delhi Sultanate, 34 kings from 5 dynasties: the slave kings, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids, and the Lodis. These Muslim conquerors were a minority group with relatively small professional armies, islands in the ocean of Hindu majority. They belonged to a different race, practiced a different religion, and were courageous warriors who feared nothing. The Hindus were divided by the caste system and did not oppose the foreign invaders. Did it really matter who ruled? The power politics of the rich and powerful made no difference to the harsh economic reality of their day-to-day struggles. Qutbuddin died after 4 years when his horse fell in a polo game. His son was unfit to rule, so the crown passed to his son-in-law, Iltamesh. Iltamesh had been purchased as a slave by Qutbuddin. One night, Qutbuddin at a banquet distributed gold to his courtiers. When Iltamesh gave his entire share to his soldiers, Qutbuddin, recognizing his greatness, married him to his daughter and raised him to the highest office. The kingdom prospered under his just rule. When he lay dying and was asked about his choice as his successor, he said, "My sons are given over to the follies of youth. There is no one better to rule than my daughter, Razia." She had all the qualities of a great king, but she was not of the right sex, and so in the estimation of men, all her virtues were worthless. Civil wars broke up the family, the people rose in revolt, killed the sultan and installed Razia not as sultana, but as sultan. Razia's choice of the Abyssinian Yakut as her favorite scandalized the power brokers who killed him and imprisoned Razia. She used her charms to captivate her jailer, the governor of Bathinda, whom she married. Together, they escaped and marched on Delhi. Her army was defeated, she fled, and was found sleeping in a field by a peasant who killed her to steal her ornaments and fine clothes. So died Razia, a great monarch, wise, just, and leader of her armies in battle. The weak 17-year-old Mahmood was crowned. He had no interest in ruling, but was lucky that an exceptionally capable slave, Balban, handled his government for 20 years till Mahmood's death, and then for another 20 years as Sultan himself. Balban was a great leader, ruthless in enforcing justice, discipline, and efficiency. In his 40 years in power, he never jested or laughed. Balban saved Delhi from the Mongols, but his son died in battle. The death of his son was more than he could bear, and within 2 years he died. The dynasty degenerated till finally Jallaluddin Khalji, the respected commander of the army, took over in a coup. He was, in turn, murdered by his ambitious and ruthless son-in-law, Aloodin, who scattered so much gold that the faithless people easily forgot the murder of the Sultan and rejoiced over his succession. On reaching Delhi, he blinded the princes, arrested their mother, and ruled for 20 years as one of the most important and powerful rulers in the history of India. Aloodin Khalji was an unusual man. Bad-tempered, obstinate, hard-hearted and cruel, he was a control freak who kept no advisors and took no advice. He worked obsessively for the good of his subjects, but said no prayers and did not even attend Friday prayers at the mosque. He was remarkably successful in all he put his hand to. In only 3 things was he frustrated: his futile attempt to ban alcohol, his passion for the Hindu queen Padmina who committed suicide, his inability to control his wife, whose father he had murdered. Aloodin repeatedly defeated the Mongols in battle. Delhi no longer feared them. He ruled as a tyrant with an efficient spy network. Corruption was eliminated, and his capable lieutenants remained loyal to their sultan. He was a brutal dictator, of whom it was said no more prosperous times than his had ever fallen to the lot of any Muslim sovereign. But age eroded his health, and his favorite, a converted Hindu named Kafur, grew in strength as commander-in-chief and vizier. Among the treasures captured in war by Kafur was a diamond whose value was sufficient to feed all of the people of the world for 2 days, the Koh-i-Noor. Aloodin died, and Kafur became regent to his 6-year-old son, arresting, blinding and murdering potential rivals in the family. He was in turn killed by the degenerate and debauched prince Mubarak, who became sultan. Mubarak cast aside all decency, attending court dressed as a woman and sometimes stark naked, mouthing obscenities. He executed his 3 brothers and was a raging homosexual whose obsession was a Hindu slave known as Khusrav. But as intensely as Mubarak loved Khusrav, Khusrav hated his master and planned to kill him. After killing the Sultan, Khusrav ascended the throne, married the widow of his master, and gave the wives and daughters of the nobles as concubines to his Hindu supporters. It was a Hindu coup, and positions of power were taken by Hindus. The Muslim Turks rallied under the leadership of the respected commander Ghazi Malik. Khusrav's generals joined battle, and the historian Barani described the scene. So these foolish, ignorant lads went forth, like newly hatched chickens just beginning to fly, to fight with the veteran warrior Ghazi Malik, who 20 times had routed the Mongols. Khusrav was killed, and Ghazi was crowned as Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, a just ruler who restored prosperity, but was killed when the roof of a building collapsed upon him. He was succeeded by his son Muhammad, who was brilliant and highly educated, but nothing that he tried succeeded. His intentions were noble, but his execution was a disaster. He was hated by his people, rebellion was rife, and his policies caused an economic collapse. He died in 1351 and was succeeded by his cousin Ferozshah, and India recovered like a sick man after an exhausting fever. Ferozshah ruled for 37 years and was ably assisted by his vizier Maqbul Khan, an illiterate but brilliant Hindu convert. Together, they rebuilt the empire. Feroz died at the age of 90, loved by his people. India was then hit by a disaster. Timur the Conqueror came, sacked Delhi, and slaughtered the population. Delhi never recovered till the rule of Balban. The general Khizr Khan had wisely joined Timur, and when Timur departed, ruled as his viceroy. Khizr's Sayyid dynasty was short-lived and was followed by the Afghan army commander Bahlul, who founded the Lodi dynasty and ruled for 39 years. The last of the Lodis, Ibrahim, was also the last king of the Delhi Sultanate. Ibrahim lost India and his life to Balban at the Battle of Panipat in 1526. Ibrahim was a good general with an army of 100,000 men against Balban's 24,000 soldiers. He also had 1,000 elephants, but Balban came with a new weapon that Ibrahim and his men had never seen before, the matchlock musket. It was this weapon that gave victory to the Ottomans and the Mongols, the two rising empires of the day.